Our first reading this morning comes from John 9, 1 through 23. As he walked along, he saw a blind man from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Jesus answered, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned. He was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world." When he had said this, he spat on the ground and made mud with the saliva and spread the mud on the man's eyes, saying to him, "Go, wash in the pool of Siloam," which means sent. Then he went and washed and came back able to see. The neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar began to ask, "Is this not the man who used to sit and beg?" Some were saying, "It is he." Others were saying, "No, but it is someone like him." He kept saying, "I am the man." But they kept asking him, "Then how were your eyes opened?" He answered, "The man called Jesus made mud, spread it on my eyes, and said to me, 'Go to Siloam and wash.' Then I went and washed and received my sight." They said to him, "Where is he?" He said, "I do not know." They brought to the Pharisees the man who had formerly been blind. Now it was the Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes. Then the Pharisees also began to ask him how he had received his sight. He said to them, "He put mud on my eyes. Then I washed, and now I see." Some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not observe the Sabbath." But others said, "How can a man who is a sinner perform such signs?" And they were divided. So they said to the blind man, "What do you say about him? It was your eyes he opened." He said, "He is a prophet." The Jews did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they called the parents of the man who had received his sight and asked them, "Is this your son, who you say was born blind? How then does he now see?" His parents answered, "We know that this is our son and that he was born blind, but we do not know how it is that now he sees, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him, he is of age, he will speak for himself." His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews, for the Jews had already agreed that anyone who confessed Jesus to be the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. Therefore, his parents said, "He is of age, ask him." Continuing our story. So for the second time, they called the man who had been blind, and they said to him, "Give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner." He answered, "I do not know whether he is a sinner. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see." They said to him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" He answered them, "I have told you already, and you would not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples?" Then they reviled him, saying, "You are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we do not know where he comes from." The man answered, "Here is an astonishing thing. You do not know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but he does listen to one who worships him and obeys his will. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a person born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." They answered him, "You were born entirely in sins, and are you trying to teach us?" And they drove him out. Jesus heard that they had driven him out, and when he found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" He answered, "And who is he, sir? Tell me so that I may believe in him." Jesus said to him, "You have seen him, and the one speaking with you is he." He said, "Lord, I believe." And he worshiped him. Jesus said, "I came into this world for judgment so that those who do not see may see, and those who do see may become blind." Some of the Pharisees near him heard this and said to him, "Surely we are not blind, are we?" Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would not have sin. But now that you say, 'We see,' your sin remains."
Thanks, Sarah. So as we're continuing in this sermon series about banded together, and we've been talking about the power of stories that pull us together, stories that we experience together, stories that define us. You know, storytelling is one of those underpinnings and one of the foundations of culture building. Stories tell us who we are. The stories that get passed on from generation to generation or by a collective larger group of people remind us of the morals that we lift up, the character qualities that we value. Stories have that power to bind people together, to galvanize people towards a story when hope is needed or when times are difficult and the story is one of tragedy. Stories are those things that we tell to one another that have deep power, don't they? How many of you have heard your story listened to? Have you ever profoundly had someone really listen to your particular story? And when your story is heard by another person, when it's shared by someone else, isn't that just this magical moment when you feel bonded to somebody? When you know that they've seen you, and in that moment particularly, if they keep leaning into your story and embracing you, it can be a magical and powerful bond that brings us together. But there's also a downside to stories, because while stories can inspire and elevate and connect us, stories can also serve to divide us, particularly when we only hear a part of the story, not the fullness of someone's story. In fact, in this story today, we see a man who has a particular story and who's been labeled as a blind man. And as you saw it in the opening, the disciples wonder the cause of his sin. He is the person that has been named as a sinner, and according to the way the story unfolds, no one will give him a break and tell him he's anything else but the sinner they've always named him to be. Imagine for a minute what it would be like in that day and age, because if you had a physical disability of any kind or a chronic illness or something like that, in those days they assigned a blame. They wanted to say, hey, who sinned? His parents must have done something wrong, or he did something wrong, because bad things don't happen to good people, is sort of the operative value that was going on. They probably told this story over and over in their culture, so it was very internalized. They had no ability to see this man as anything else but as a product of sin or the cause of sin himself. And regardless of his circumstances, they would have found evidence in his life or in his family's life that would have reinforced that point of view. This is a person who has no status. This person is not someone who would have been invited to church. He wouldn't even been able to sit in the pew next to someone like this. And if he came in at all to the ancient synagogue, he would have been sitting on the outer corners, if in at all, maybe overhearing what was said, but sinners would never have been invited into the sanctuary where righteous people were. Certainly, he would never have been asked to teach Sunday school. He would never have been on the volunteer list. In fact, he was the kind of person that if you were traveling in your village and you saw him, what would you have done? You'd have stepped to the other side of the road, because you yourself don't want to be polluted by association by someone like him. You see, the single narrative of he's a sinner marked his life and that of his family in such a destructive way that even when Jesus meets him, sees him, heals him, the people in the story find it so incredulous that that could be the same man, that the story goes on. Do you remember at first it says, well, some people thought it was that guy, but they said it can't be, because their category was, it certainly could not, the guy who's looking and seeing and talking and telling us of this story, the one who would be the recipient of this amazing Jesus healer teacher man, it can't be that guy. Because by definition, that guy never gets into Jesus' presence. That guy doesn't deserve to have the healing touch of Jesus. And so they say it can't be him. It kind of looks like him, but it can't be him. And then when he goes and he talks to the religious people, they doubt the veracity of his story. They say, well, if he can see now, it must be true that he's lying. He was never blind in the first place. And even when they bring his parents on, his parents are so afraid of the labels and what this means that they too sort of push off the blame and say, let him talk for himself. Yes, that's the guy, but we can't explain any of this. He'll have to explain it. And when he does try to explain it over and over again, it says he's insulted. He's diminished. They find it so outside of the way that they're thinking that this could not possibly be true. And in the end, they actually throw him out of the religious community, it says. You see, this is the danger of a story that's told over and over and over and over again, is that when we define people by one certain part of their story and don't take the time to listen to the whole story, you see, we're impoverished as a community when we reduce someone to a single story or a single narrative. You know, all of us have versions of this because most of us have grown up in families or part of a culture where at some time during our lives, we were told we were not, and then fill in the blank. We weren't smart enough, or we weren't as smart as an older brother or a sibling or a sister or a neighbor or someone else. We weren't pretty enough. We weren't straight enough. We weren't good enough. Whatever it is, many of us have grown up and took that label and took it to heart. I know that in my family, growing up in the 60s, we were a family that privileged the boys in my family, and the girls were really not very much. And I grew up with the narrative that I couldn't be smart enough, I wasn't pretty enough, I was way too tall, and I talked way too much for a girl. And you know, that narrative prevented me from pursuing ministry and seminary for decades because I was afraid I wasn't smart enough to be able to handle the language or the theological training that would be required of me. But just like that man, if I had let that narrative of me, that I wasn't smart enough, too tall, too talkative, whatever, be the defining narrative, let that be the bitter last word in my life, it would have been a very different life. Just like if that man in this story had let his blindness and that label of sinner be the final bitter word of his life, he might not have been open to the healing power of Jesus. You see, just like that blind man, Jesus came into my life and changed that narrative from those negative messages and told me that I had value. And just like that man in this story, and just like my story, and just like in your story, all of us need to be able to tell the fullness of our whole story and not be defined by a negative, bitter, untrue label. You see, sometimes we use these labels in our lives, and I'm not talking about these, but all sorts of labels in our lives, and sometimes they help us categorize the world, right? So when we say that there's certain qualities that females have or males have or people that live in the Midwest or people that live in California, well, those maybe help us give some understandings to some regional differences or gender differences or things like that. But when we only see people within those labels and never let them define those labels for themselves, we then internalize this negative story over and over again. And as a people or group of people begin to internalize these things, then we get things like sexism and racism and homophobia. We get a sort of a political centrism that only our way of seeing the world is correct and only our solutions are the ones that matter. And as we do, the divides become wider and deeper and harder to cross. It's amazing that in this story, this man is fighting narrative after narrative, that all these people he encounters for the right to be more than a sinner. Here is one of the most astonishing miracles that the Bible narrates. Somebody who was born blind has received his sight. And people in the face of transformative miracles refuse to believe it because they're more committed to their single story narrative than they are to seeing what God can do in people's lives. The church, if anywhere, should be a place where that charge should never be leveled against us. We should be a people who always are open to seeing how God is working and how God is transforming you and me, our church, our region, our country, our world. We should be the ones who are attentive to the transformative part of the story, not a label that diminishes and defaces the glory of God in another person. Chimamanda Adichie, a Nigerian writer, writes this when she talks about the danger of the single story. Chimamanda is a novelist from Nigeria who has given a really very powerful TED Talk, and I would encourage you to look it up if you're interested. She's called The Danger of the Single Story. She talks about how when she came to the U.S. as a college student, her college roommate really knew nothing about Nigeria. And so her roommate was surprised that she spoke English. And when asked if she would play some of her tribal music, was surprised when Chimamanda brought out her CD of Mariah Carey. And she talks about how even in her writing, people would tell her it wasn't African enough because her male figures in her story were not more abusive. Chimamanda says in this TED Talk, what struck me, and she's speaking of her roommate, was that she felt sorry for me even before she saw me. Her default position toward me as an African was kind of patronizing, but it was a well-meaning pity. My roommate had a single story of Africa, a single story of catastrophe. And in this single story, there was no possibility of Africans being similar to her in any way. There was no possibility of feelings more complex than pity, no possibility of connection as humans. You see, it's important for us to hear and listen to the whole of a story and not to let the labels we use, the categories we use, even though they may be sometimes have a kernel of truth, be the determining factor of our relationships with one another. I find it amazing that in this story, our main character, this blind man, I wish we knew his name, he is so exasperated as he is fighting to have his story told, his new way of seeing validated, a person who's trying to point to the one who offered him this amazing gift of healing, and everyone seems to be diminishing it. He says, how astonishing it is. You do not see where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but he does listen to the one who worships him and obeys his will. Never since the whole world began has anyone had their eyes opened, a person who was born blind. So if this man were not from God, he could do nothing. And even with that statement, they threw him out of the temple. I love the fact that after all of this unfolds, Jesus still goes looking for him. Jesus finds him and they have this incredible exchange. You see, because Jesus understood the power of the single story too. Remember, this was a young man, as we talked about last week, that was born in a backwater area of Nazareth in a small community where everyone would have questioned the morality of his parents. They would not have ever understood Mary's story of a miraculous conception. In fact, many of us today still wonder about that too. Jesus would have been someone who would have been ostracized as a moral failure of his parents. He would have been seen in the lowest caste of society as a laborer. He was someone who was from a town that meant nothing. He knew what it was like to be defined by a single story. And I wonder, what was the turning point for Jesus where instead of living into that negative identity that he had been given his whole life, did his parents help counterbalance that as a child? Was it perhaps the stories of his dedication in the temple when there were prophecies made over him? But they might have seemed quite distant as he grew into be a young man. Was it that moment at his baptism when the sky opens up and there's a voice from heaven that says, "This is my beloved." Was that somehow a turning point for Jesus and for those who would come to know him, that there was something more to this carpenter from Nazareth of unsure parentage? And then was it Jesus living into that identity as he taught and as he healed? And even then, even in this story, he is not seen for who he is or believed or validated for the transformative story, not only that he presented, but that he offered to other people. What was it like in his own life as that narrative took a downward turn at his trial, his crucifixion? And then his very resurrection was doubted. I wonder what it was like for his disciples who, in following him, took on some of that same identity. You're the follower of that loser from Nazareth, and yet something changed for them too when the Holy Spirit came, and we are part of that transformative story. The story that began with Jesus is told many times over, and a man like the blind man carried forward throughout the world by his disciples, and is now a story that is part of our lives too. The danger of the single story is when it blinds us to see what God is doing among God's people. Sometimes the most unexpected, as the song showed today, the illegal, the addict, the ex-convict, people who we don't think should be part of the family of God, but who receive God's love and mercy. Those of us like us, who may not have a dramatic turnaround story, but who still live and have worked to overcome those negative labels in our life, who fight to have a story told of our value and our worth, of being contributors to a community, regardless of what past messages we have been bound to. These are the stories worth telling. And like the blind man in this story, we must tell them with assurance and joy and conviction that we are the beloved. Take the time to tell these stories. More importantly, take the time to listen to these stories that other people tell. For in the end, these are the stories worth hearing. Amen.